Just have people getting in.
Are you gonna start recording like when we start talking or right now?
It's recording right now. So it's right at 1 o'clock, so we'll get started to respect everyone's time. Hello, my name is Dan Saipan. I'm the Director of Global Experiential Learning, or GEL, here at the University of Arizona. What GEL tries to do is incorporate travel, multicultural education, and service learning into inclusive and diverse programs all throughout the world. Of course, we're in a pandemic right now, so we're gonna have you virtually travel with us. We are fortunate enough to have my sister and colleague here, Piikea, that has led our Alternative Spring Break Hawaii program for the past 3 years. And we wanna bring that knowledge and base to the rest of the University of Arizona and who else is listening on this webinar. So I also wanna introduce my team, Aries Castillo, who has been working on this project as well. Aries?
Hi everyone, my name is Aries or Ariana Castillo. I am a senior here at the University of Arizona, majoring in criminal justice with a minor in psychology. Before we get started, it is important on behalf of GEL that we recognize the lands we are currently residing on, which are that of the Tohono O'odham and Pasquayaqui people. Therefore, we would like to take this opportunity to conduct a land acknowledgement that the university sits on the original homelands of indigenous people who have stewarded this land since time immemorial. Aligning with the university's core value of a diverse and inclusive community, it is an institutional responsibility to recognize and acknowledge the people, culture, and history that make up the Wildcat community. At the institutional level, it is important to be proactive in broadening awareness throughout the campus to ensure students feel represented and valued. Before we also get started, I just want to mention for all the panelists that throughout the webinar, we will be having the Q&A box open. So feel free to drop your questions and towards the end, we'll get to those. I want to introduce you all to our special guest. We have Piikea Hardy Kahliomi. She is our friend from Hawaii. We have spent our time traveling over there in the past with our alternative study abroad break, and she has helped being our guide and our resource there. Just to give a brief overview of her and her work, she has spent more than 30 years working with underserved populations through various community-based organizations, endeavoring to address issues of poverty, houselessness, incarceration, addiction, and social justice, primarily in her hometown of Waianae, Hawaii, and in the Oakland, California communities. She is currently an associate professor in the University of Hawaii Community College System. As a Native Hawaiian counselor at Leeward Community College, she is able to combine her understanding of social dynamics and love for her Hawaiian culture to optimally serve her students. Piikea holds a Bachelor's of Science in both Criminal Justice and Behavioral Science with an emphasis in psychology from Chaminade University and a Master's of Art in Cross-Cultural Counseling Psychology from John F. Kennedy University. Please welcome Ms. Piikea.
All right. Do we stop sharing this one for now? Okay. Aloha. I'm really honored to be here. I'm happy to be sharing this time with you. I did want to start by telling you a little story. So when I was 17 years old, I remember learning this chant that I'm going to do for you. And one of my kumu, or teachers, talked to me about the importance of aloha. And what he shared with me was this story about these two gods, Kanaloa and Kane, who would walk the land, and each time that they would go to different places, they would see if people would invite them in and offer them food and drink. And whenever that did not happen, they actually would punish folks by creating a famine that came over the land. And there was this one place in particular, this home of this elderly couple, and they were the only ones living there, and they didn't have much, but everything they had, they gave to Kane and Kanaloa. And after staying with them for a few days, they woke up early one morning before the couple woke, and Kane struck his stick into the ground and brought forth a spring. Now, in Hawaiian culture, water is considered to be the richest, most life-giving resource that you can have. So our word for water is wai, and our word for wealthy is wai wai. And so he gave them the greatest gift that anyone could receive. And then they left. And so when the couple awoke and they saw this spring, they knew that they had hosted these gods who are able to give them this gift. And I think what was interesting about the story is this idea of inviting people in and sharing what you have, because you never know who they are. And it obviously shouldn't be for gain or punishment. I think that's a side part of that story. But I think what was really interesting to me was really understanding the core of our cultural stories and why things like aloha are so important to us. And so through that story, there is this tradition that whenever you see people, or in this case, inviting people in, as I'm inviting you into the story of my ancestors, to invite you in with a chant. And really this chant that we call Oli Aloha is to share our care, our affection, our love with the people that we encounter. So here's that chant. O nauna ka halame kalehua, he haleleu hua noia na ka noe. O ka unoia no inei, e li anei ho'i o ka hiki mai. A hiki mai no o kou, a hiki puno me ke aloha. Aloha e, aloha e, aloha e, aloha. So you're all welcomed into this space, into this information. And having told you about this Oli Aloha, I also want to talk about the title. And the title is called Aloha, the Intelligence with Which We Greet the World. Growing up, often in movies, I would see folks talk about the word aloha as meaning hello and goodbye. So one really important thing I want to share with you is that aloha does not mean hello or goodbye. Aloha, actually the same komu, shared an interesting definition of the word. He broke it into two parts. The word alo is our word for face, and it's also our word meaning to be present. Because the most important way to be present with someone, alo ihe alo, face to face, looking in someone's eyes, seeing their expression, feeling their energy. So alo means to be present, and the word ha means the breath. But really it's your essence, because without breath, there is no life. And so the word aloha he shared with us, it has many meanings, but the one that I thought was so interesting and endearing was how he defined it as commitment, right? To be present with your essence takes commitment. Commitment to you as my brother, my sister, my family, because we share this planet. And the understanding that it's not a nice thing to do, but actually it's a responsibility to ensure that we have important connections with each other. The greatest illusion is the idea of separateness. None of us are separate. And so when we recognize the connections that we have, using the word aloha, like I said, we don't say that to mean hello or goodbye. It's actually an acknowledgement of our commitment to each other, that I see you, that I'm committed because I see you as my family. And that representation, and you may see that in some of the slides or maybe even the video, but the way that we acknowledge that aloha is we actually share ha, we share breath. And we actually kind of put our foreheads touching, and you exhale from the nose and you take in each other's essence. And that is something you do with people that you're very close to, but the idea is that a part of your life force will live inside of me forever. And I'm making that choice, and that person is making that choice as well. So that's that acknowledgement. So there's a lot around the word aloha in terms of concept and the way we live. But literally the saying of that word is really the acknowledgement of the commitment. And so I do believe that the idea or the commitment to creating connection and healthy communities, good relationships, is definitely takes a lot of intelligence, and it's an important skill and important commitment to make. And so those words, the title of this workshop, was uttered by our last reigning monarch, Queen Liliuokalani. And I know I can't see you all, but I hope that you'll say it with me, because I'd like you to say her name, because I'm going to tell her story. So it's Liliuokalani. And like I said, she was our last reigning monarch. So I'm gonna kind of jump in right now. This is very odd for me. I teach, I love to teach, and it's just really odd to be looking at a camera and not seeing your face or feeling your energy. So I like to think in my mind that you feel what I'm putting out there. And I'm gonna think about each of you as I'm talking about this history. So yeah, it's kind of weird, but I'm gonna do my best. So the first thing I'd like to do is I want you to reflect. I want you to reflect and think about your ancestors before I start talking about mine. I want you to think about your ancestors and think about that history, their history, which is yours, your history as well. And I want you to take a couple seconds to think about how the history of your ancestors and ultimately your history has impacted you today. How has that impacted where you live, the language that you speak, your values, your thoughts, how you see your future, the things you know you're capable of, or the things that you feel like you really need to work on. But looking at that history and how has it impacted you? And if you want to close your eyes to think about it, that's fine too. But I really want you to bring your ancestors. Our word for that is kupuna. That's the name for our elders and our ancestors. I want you to bring them into your thinking as you hear about this history. All right. So keep that in your mind. The other thing I want you to think about, and Aries is typing this in the chat. She's my maestro today. She's directing everything, so I really appreciate her. The other thing I want you to think about, and please type this in the chat, is when you think about Hawaii, can you just type in maybe one or two words that come to mind when you hear Hawaii and whatever thoughts you have about that particular place? Okay, I can see a bunch of you must have been here. So I think I'm probably preaching to the choir then. I appreciate that feedback. Okay, mahalo for that. All right, so I'm going to share my screen with you. So I think, there we are. So I want to say this, and this part was the challenging part for me. So I am trying to put over 200 years of Hawaiian history into about 15 minutes, 15 to 20 minutes. So it was really hard for me to think about what I was going to cut out because, you know, and still have it all make sense. So the first thing I wanted to talk about is talking about, you know, from the very beginning, oceanic people. So this is people all through the Pacific. They see themselves as wayfinders, and people call them navigators. But I think the idea of being a wayfinder is not just physically finding your way in the world, but within yourself as well, right? And so, because they, you know, it was always said that if you cannot picture arriving at that place and firmly knowing how, it doesn't matter if you're in a physical setting, you must know within yourself before you even start the journey that you know how to get there. And so the idea of wayfinding is a really important part of oceanic people's concept of themselves. And so oceanic people, there are many journals that have been written, particularly by explorers in the Pacific, that talk about the superior navigation skills of oceanic people and their ability to use animals of the ocean and the swells, and of course memorize every star in the sky to get to different destinations. At one point, it was thought that they reached Hawaii by accident, and as well as all the other Pacific islands. And so one of the things that dispelled that was a canoe called the hokule'a, and individuals were able to learn oceanic wayfinding and basically were able and continue to voyage on the hokule'a by using traditional means, not using any instruments, to navigate around the globe. And actually in 2013, and it went all the way through to, I believe it was 2018, that they literally went to from one side of the earth to the other on this canoe. So that was pretty amazing, and such an amazing undertaking, and very uniting for a lot of indigenous people all around the world. So in addition to that, we also know, which is not heavily reported in most history books, we know that they also went to, in addition to discovering the Pacific Islands, that they also went to North America as well as South America. And the reason we know that is because, for example, the sweet potato that we see all over, and now we can do DNA testing, we know that that came from South America. And some say, well, maybe it just floated on the ocean. But the word that we use for sweet potato is the same word that they use in this particular area of South America. So you know that we met up because you don't get language transfer by finding things floating on the ocean, right? So, and sometimes I feel like, you know, just give people credit, right? Give credit where credit is due. Instead of looking for ways to say, no, that couldn't have happened, they couldn't have done it. They did do it. And so our word is uala. And in New Zealand, who are other Polynesian peoples, they use the word kumara, which actually is closest to the word that is used in South America. So, so that's one. And also livestock. You know, they did DNA testing on certain chickens that we have in Polynesia, and they also trace it back. The origin is South America. And we also know that we went to North America. One reason is because of the canoes. There's a certain canoe that they found in a tribe in Southern California that no other tribe around them had this kind of canoe. And it was very similar to the Tahitian voyaging canoe that they also use for racing. So, and it was completely different from any other type of structure of canoe that they had seen in the Americas. So again, we know that we definitely have been traveling for quite some time, but other people generally get credit for different discoveries. What we know is there's many islands actually in the Hawaiian archipelago, but when we talk about Hawaii, we generally focus on these 8 islands. And I say this because, you know, other countries that are made up of archipelagos, we may know there's a bunch of islands, but we may not know what their names are. So Hawaii is called Hawaii actually because the king, which I will talk about in a second, who united all the islands was actually from Hawaii Island right here. So he named the entire kingdom after his island of birth. But just to let you know, the capital currently is on the island of Oahu. And it's not the biggest island, but we do have about 80% of the population. So Hawaii is a little over 1 million people, and about 800,000 people live here. So that's a lot. Honolulu and Waiheke are also on Oahu. So if you ever come out and visit, I was born and raised on Oahu, but I have to tell you that I do like getting out to the other islands. There's a lot less people. It's a lot less crowded. But most people come to Oahu first. So, and Oahu was formed basically by, we have a hot spot, right? So the tectonic plate keeps moving. And right now the hot spot is under Hawaii Island. And the volcano there called Kilauea has been erupting since 1982. And it's never stopped. So you can imagine that's partly why it's such a big island. And people do refer to Hawaii Island as the Big Island. I do not, but because I like using the names that our ancestors use, but because it really is a very, very big island. So, okay. So I'm gonna kind of get through this history and do it in the time that I try to allot for myself. And then we can eventually open up for questions. Okay, so here, this is a depiction of King Kamehameha. He was known as Kamehameha the Great or Kamehameha Ekahi, Kamehameha the First. And there are many different ali'i who did attempt to unite all the islands. Every island had their own ruling monarch and their own ruling family. But by 1810, Kamehameha, through warfare and some negotiation, when he couldn't win the war, the wars that he waged, he finally was able to unite all of the islands in 1810. Primarily Kamehameha won because he was able to make good alliances with foreigners who had access to guns and weapons that most Hawaiian rulers did not. Hawaiians primarily fought with spears and different kind of more close combat kinds of weapons. And so guns and cannons also made all the difference. And Kamehameha was able to acquire enough of that to make a big difference in the wars that he waged against the other ruling families. And so that allowed him to win. Now, there was another thing around Hawaiian culture that believes that when you start winning a lot of wars, that the gods must be on your side. And so by the time he reached some of the islands that were farther from Hawaii, they were willing to negotiate because their sense is that there must be something about this leader, although he was not a high-ranking ali'i or king, that meant that he had favor. So that was another reason why these ruling families were willing to negotiate with him the closer we got to 1810. Now Kamehameha rules for another 9 years and then he passes. And even his death is controversial. Some people think that he did not die of natural causes, but we don't know for sure. But after he ruled in 1810 until his death in 1819, he actually declared peace. He said no more wars, that there should be a time of peace in Hawaii. And many of the ruling families, he actually allowed them to continue to rule those islands and those people. They just needed to pledge their allegiance to him. And obviously, if there were times when he needed to call on them, he expected them to follow his wishes. And then right after Kamehameha passes, the first missionaries come to Hawaii in 1820. So there had been many different people who had come to Hawaii. Interestingly enough, Captain Cook, who in many books is credited with discovering Hawaii, talks about what he saw when he got here. What I always find interesting is I don't know how you can discover land when there's literally thousands of people already there. but it seems to be pretty common. And you still see in books that state that Captain Cook was the person who discovered, maybe he discovered it for Europeans, I'm not sure. But anyway, so um, so they had been here for some time, but it was in 1820 that missionaries came to Hawaii to begin the process of Christianizing the native people. And the Hawaiian language at that point was not a written language. And so Hawaiians were very fascinated by the Bible. And very quickly, Hawaiians actually became, and I'm going to use these interchangeably, the word Kanaka, because in general, Hawaiians, they're called Hawaiians today. They consider themselves, or they call themselves Kanaka. Many indigenous people actually call themselves something different than what colonizers eventually call them and still call them today. So you're going to see some interchanging of those words. But when I say Kanaka, I do mean the native people of Hawaii. Anyway, they were very much interested in reading and getting their hands on anything to learn more about the world around them. You know, they lived on an island, and Hawaii is probably, no, it is the most isolated islands in the whole world, you know, in terms of how far they are from any other landmass. Some people are, most people actually are quite amazed when they understand voyaging, how oceanic people even found Hawaii at all. But so anyway, they were very much interested in learning to read and getting their hands on anything that they could. At this point, after learning how to read, Hawaiians actually began writing, newspapers. And right now, of any nation in the Pacific, in Hawaii, we actually have the largest collection of written work, over 1 million pages of work written in Hawaiian. And so currently many Hawaiian scholars are working to translate a lot of, I think I went too forward, a lot of what was written. But anyway, so the literacy rates, like I said, were through the roof. I don't know that there's any other country that has ever had a literacy rate that high. And also with that and access to more information, Hawaiians began to make it a point to speak multiple languages, and they began to study abroad. That's one of the reasons why the missionaries became aware of Hawaiians and where they were, because we had several of our scholars that went to Boston and they started to go to the universities there. And so because of those missionaries learning about Hawaii, they started to learn some Hawaiian language from these Kanaka that went over to Boston and then decided to come to Hawaii to convert Native people to Christianity. What we see, and please know I'm skipping a lot of history. So what we see in terms of the impacts of foreign contact is that eventually the missionaries definitely felt that Hawaiian culture and Hawaiian cultural practices were un-Christian, and they called for the banning of the religion as well as cultural practices, especially hula. They called for the burning of, temples and statues. And as our monarchs, particularly Queen Ka'ahumanu, began to convert to Christianity, they acquiesced. And so you saw a lot of the eradication of those practices. We had practitioners go underground, which thank goodness, that's the only way that we still have hula and many of our chants today, is because people were subversive and in a good way, and ensured that we still continue to have those practices. We've lost a lot of information, but I'm very grateful for Kupuna, who understood the importance of preserving our culture. We also saw that the children of the missionaries, they began to become quite wealthy in Hawaii. In Hawaii, we call them the Big Five, and started owning a lot of land, became sugar plantation moguls, and it became very important to them to start trying to insert themselves into the Hawaiian Kingdom government so that they could control what was happening, for the most part, for their own best interests of their business and their wealth. We also see that by 1840, there was an introduction of all kinds of foreign diseases that Hawaiians had no defense against. And so it absolutely massacred our Hawaiian population. And in addition to that, our monarchs at the time were noticing that Western powers were basically snatching up island nations all across the Pacific. You know, France took Tahiti, the Dutch, you know, they initially took Rapa Nui, which is also called Easter Island, and also New Zealand, which the native people there call Aotearoa. And so I think there was definitely a fear that Hawaii was next. And so in many ways, our monarchy were trying to get ahead of it. And so in learning English, they even adopted English first names. So they would be more aligned to the culture of these major world powers. They started to adopt even Western dress, a lot of ways to align themselves, you know, like I said, with these major world powers. And so one of the things that Kamehameha III understood was that as much as we had these great foreign relations, if there was no recognition of the sovereignty of the Hawaiian kingdom, that we would be snatched up very quickly. And so in 1840, Kamehameha III, and his name was Kauai Keaoli, he sent these delegates out. Now, I want to be really clear. It's not like the delegate goes and like knocks on the door and says, hey, got a treaty for you. Can you sign it? Like, it doesn't happen that way, right? It's a lot of negotiation. And, you know, to be accepted into what they called the family of nations, they needed to see you as, at that time especially, an educated, articulate person who came from a country of value, right? And because they didn't just let anyone in. And so the fact that these delegates from Hawaii negotiating on behalf of the monarchy were able to get these things signed was actually a pretty major feat, particularly in the short period of time that they were able to get these signed. And in Hawaii, the monarchy had really great relations, especially with Great Britain. In part, that's why our flag, the Hawaiian Kingdom flag, incorporates the Union Jack. But here, this was what I have here is a copy of the very first recognition of Hawaiian sovereignty. And this is both from Great Britain and from France. So I'm going to show you a couple more. So obviously, this is one of the two treaties where the US recognized Hawaiian sovereignty. And by the way, in all of these countries, Hawaii also had an embassy, right? So the idea is when you have an embassy in another country, that wherever that embassy sits, that is the lands of that other country. And in our case, the Hawaiian Kingdom. So Sweden, Norway, Spain. Japan is interesting. With Japan, Hawaii was the first country to actually recognize the sovereignty of Japan. And obviously Japan recognized Hawaiian sovereignty as well, but Hawaii actually was the first to recognize their sovereignty, which is why I put it on there. Well, let me go back. So, and actually there's many more treaties. Like what I put in here is just a handful, but there's many, many more treaties. And I'm gonna include at some point, I think I'm gonna have to send it to Dan after, a resource page. So if any of you wanna go back and look up some of these facts, I can definitely give that to you. But there were a number of treaties. I believe it was over 30 something treaties that was signed by every major world power just about in the world. So it was very much established that Hawaii was a sovereign nation. And then in 1854, there is this proclamation of neutrality. And the United States is one of the individuals that signed this. Now, what this means is that Hawaii is declaring itself a neutral country, meaning that the Kingdom of Hawaii will not wage war against anyone else, and that no other country is going to wage war against Hawaii. And also, if there's ever like Hawaiian ships or anything in international waters, that they are to be protected, because both their sovereignty and their neutrality is recognized. So these are the actual documents. Now, I've skipped several different dynasties right now. But so now we enter King David Kalakaua, and you notice he has an English first name. Hawaiians generally, even though we have English names, a lot of times we actually don't go by them. But anyway, so King Kalakaua, he was known as the Merry Monarch. It was very important to him to revive the Hawaiian culture. And so he was not necessarily very popular with non-native citizens or foreigners, because he definitely was seen as kind of stirring up some stuff that folks definitely wanted to squash. And so he was looking at reviving the hula in particular. And we, till this day, have a dance competition called the Merry Monarch, named after him, where we have people from literally all over the world that come to Hawaii and participate in dance, a dance competition of hula. In addition, he was traveling the world trying to create a trans-Pacific alliance, because he was no dummy. He saw that more and more, you had these Western powers pushing into different places in the world and just kind of snatching up different sovereign nations because they had the power to do so. And so his thought was to create this trans-Pacific alliance to allow all of those smaller countries to be able to protect themselves. Unfortunately, in 1887, he was forced at gunpoint to sign something called the Bayonet Constitution. And the short story of it is that you had individuals who were able to acquire weapons, marched into the palace, and basically said, sign this or we'll kill you. And it was pretty clear that if he did not sign it, he would probably have been killed right then and there. And what the Constitution did was take away all of his power, forced him to basically make his entire cabinet resign, and replace the legislature with these insurgents, these people who really were traitors to the Hawaiian kingdom. Unfortunately, they also happened to be very rich and powerful. They owned the sugar plantations, and they were, like I was saying before, they were children of missionaries. So their parents were American citizens. So while Kalakaua is trying to create this Trans-Pacific Alliance, trying to do whatever he can to bring his power back, he passes away from measles. Remember, Hawaiians are really, not able to deal with a lot of these foreign diseases. And so he actually dies in San Francisco, and his body is shipped back in 1891. And at that point, Queen Liliuokalani, who I mentioned her earlier, she realizes that her brother is gone and that she needs to ascend the throne. Interestingly enough, after Kalakaua was forced to sign the Bayonet Constitution, he did fear that his time was ticking. And so he immediately named his sister as the heir apparent. And so she ascended the throne. And she decides to create a new constitution, because the old constitution, not only does she know that it takes all her power away, but the practice of most monarchs, and at this point, by the way, they're elected by the people. So they definitely move toward having a more democratic system. But every new monarch would actually go to the people, which might seem odd and not what you normally hear about monarchs. But in Hawaii, monarchs understood that the primary people they always had to serve was their people and not themselves. And so she did go to the masses. She went to the different islands, and that took some time to get the feedback of all of her people, whether they were native or not, right? Because Hawaii is a kingdom made up of all different kinds of people. And even though Kanaka were decimated by these foreign diseases, still the primary population were Kanaka. And so the feedback she gets from all of them is that they don't like this constitution. They don't like these individuals making laws to benefit themselves. It's not benefiting the people. And as the new monarch, the new queen, they want her to change that. So when she finishes her survey of her people, she comes back to this group that are naming themselves the Committee of Safety. This is basically the same people that forced Kalakaua to sign the Bayonet Constitution. And it is a little ironic that they're calling themselves the Committee of Safety, because the only people's safety that they're looking out for is themselves. And they're a group of about 13 folks who are non-native individuals of American descent or foreigners, all of whom are white. And all of them are rich, and they have business interests, particularly and primarily in the sugar industry. So immediately they start to conspire with the US ambassador to the Hawaiian Kingdom. His name is John Stevens. And by January of, sorry, I keep flipping this. By January of 1893, the US troops are asked to land in Hawaii because the ambassador is saying that American lives are at risk, which is absolutely false. But that's basically the way he knows that he's going to convince the captain to land his troops there. So what we find, and again, I'm skipping a lot of different details. We find that in January of 1893, when the US military lands on Hawaiian soil, that is basically based on international law, that is considered an act of war. Now remember, there's two treaties in place, right? Recognition of sovereignty, that Hawaii is a sovereign nation, and the Treaty of Neutrality. So America is violating a bunch of different things, their own treaties, by the way, by doing this. And so when this happens, the Queen immediately writes a letter to the US president at the time, Benjamin Harrison, who ignores her letter, because Benjamin Harrison definitely wants the United States to acquire Hawaii. Now, at that time, Liliuokalani already knows that if she sends her people and the royal guard to fight, that it's going to be a bloodbath and they're not going to win. And one of the ways that a country can acquire, right, another country, annex another country by international law is through war. And that's not something she wants to risk. So she continues to try and reach out to Harrison. In the meantime, this Committee of Safety drafts, they declare themselves the Republic of Hawaii, and they draft this fake treaty. They have absolutely no legal right to draft any of it because they are not the legal sovereigns of the Kingdom of Hawaii, but they're pretending, right? They want to affect this end of America annexing Hawaii, because as sugar plantation owners, there's these high taxes on Hawaiian sugar going into the United States. I don't know if anybody's ever used the brand C&H sugar. It's a pretty popular brand. Well, that stands for California and Hawaii Sugar. And that company was something that was started back then in this time that I'm talking about. And so sugar was our biggest industry and our biggest moneymaker at the time. And so the sugar plantation owners would definitely save money on all these really high taxes. They would secure their power as major business individuals, and they already had infiltrated the government. And so, aligning themselves with the United States was something that would be beneficial for them. Now, what was in it for the United States was this. The United States more and more were venturing into the Pacific, and they actually sent spies, and this is the truth, this is something you can read up. They sent spies, for example, like General Schofield, to scope out different places. And what he said was that Pearl Harbor was one of the best natural harbors that he had ever seen. And so they kept trying to get Hawaii as a military stronghold. And particularly, they really, really wanted to get Pearl Harbor, which is on the island of Oahu. So they were having negotiations on taking this country that they had multiple treaties with, that they would not do any of these things, but they went ahead and did this anyway. So in February, like I said here, the Republic of Hawaii is trying to send this fake treaty of annexation. Interestingly enough, there's people in Congress that are saying, but all the people that signed this treaty, they're not the sovereigns. We can't sign this. So it gets pushed out. And so Benjamin Harrison loses the next election, and Grover Cleveland becomes the next president. And what's interesting is that Grover Cleveland knows Queen Liliuokalani. he's literally spent time with her. They, at one point, were going to the Queen's Jubilee in Great Britain, and there was, Lili'u had a stopover in the United States and had dinner and spent time with Grover Cleveland. And so they have a little bit of a relationship, and he understands that this is not right. And so he rescinds the treaty, and then he sends a delegate over to basically investigate. And again, I'm really abbreviating this, but in the end, the delegate says that America was absolutely wrong, that they never should have landed troops there, that the sovereignty of the Queen needs to be restored as soon as possible, and America needs to make any type of, basically needs to do everything to correct the wrong that has been done. But the biggest problem is that in order to remove the troops, they're going to have a congressional order to do that. And so it's always difficult, right? Because especially at that time, Liliuokalani was being portrayed as a savage queen, and that she was a tyrant, and that the people did not want her as queen. And there was a lot of this going on in newspapers, and actually, to be honest, some pretty racist depictions of her and some other individuals, like from individuals in the Philippines and in Guam and Puerto Rico also. And so there was this kind of narrative that was going around, all in the hopes of convincing, particularly the American government, to annex Hawaii. And I just want to be clear about annexation. Annexation can only occur if there's an agreement by the other sovereign nation and a treaty is signed, and we're talking outside of war. So that never happened, and we'll get to that in a little bit. But it's just interesting, these treaties that were written by these, like this fake government, eventually that was what was accepted by the United States as an official document, which it absolutely is not. Okay, so Grover Cleveland keeps trying to convince Congress that, you know, they need to do this, they need to right this wrong. He cannot get them to agree to do this, because they're going to need to send in additional troops to remove not just the US military, but also now there's mercenaries, individuals that the Committee of Safety have paid to intimidate and harass individuals that are loyal to the Queen and to the Hawaiian government. At that same time, we're getting closer to the end of Grover Cleveland's, I shouldn't say this is his second term. So it's kind of weird. Grover Cleveland was president, he lost, Benjamin Harrison became president, Harrison lost, and Grover Cleveland came back. So technically this was Grover Cleveland's second term. But the person who gets elected is William McKinley. And he is basically wanting Hawaii. There is no doubt in his mind, and he doesn't care if it violates all these treaties or international law. He wants to do whatever he needs to do to get Hawaii, primarily because America is about to go into the Spanish-American War. And they need a military stronghold to fight the Spanish in Guam and the Philippines. And in order to win that war, they're going to need Hawaii. And these insurgents, who are very powerful individuals in Hawaii, are definitely willing to conspire with them to commit treason against the Hawaiian Kingdom. So in 1897, McKinley ratifies this treaty of annexation that's coming from this fake self-declared government. And they do it through what's called a joint resolution, which is illegal outside of American borders, right? So it's kind of like if our joint resolution means that the House and the Senate agreed, in this case, to take Hawaii. That is no more legal than them saying they're gonna, as our government saying that they're gonna annex Germany or annex Greece, right? There's no jurisdiction. American law has no jurisdiction outside of its borders. But basically, that's what they're saying. And if you read history books, they say that they acquired Hawaii through a joint resolution, which is not legal at all. So this acquisition of Hawaii And I want to be really clear about that. There's nothing legal. Hawaii has never legally been a part of the United States. And then in 1897, there's a Ku'e petition. So this petition, which many of us actually can go back to this petition from 1897 and find our kupuna, our ancestors, and see their names. They had two different petitions. One petition had every citizen of Hawaii who agreed with, or I should say, disagreed with annexation. So this included everyone. And they had a separate petition because in America, women were not allowed to vote. And so what they didn't want was to throw out the first petition by saying, well, we don't accept the names of all of these other people because we wouldn't allow them to vote anyway. So they had a separate one specifically with men and specifically with only Hawaiian citizens. And still, both of those petitions were huge. As you can see here, like I said, 95% of the population signed. And you may realize it's very difficult to even get 50% of any population of a nation to sign anything. So that is quite large. So here I'm going very quickly. So even though that petition was hand delivered to the US Congress and they were told that, this was not a revolution, which growing up, I definitely saw things about a Hawaiian revolution, which would suggest the people were rising up against the monarchy. That was absolutely false. And America obviously ignored these Ku'e petitions, ignored the fact that the citizens of Hawaii did not want to be annexed by the United States, and ignored the fact that they were consistently told that everything they did was illegal. It did not matter to them. By 1896, the Hawaiian language was banned in schools. The monarchy was dismantled entirely by 1898. And this is the interesting part too. There was a lot of individuals who were still very loyal to the Queen and to the Hawaiian Kingdom. And so they basically were not allowed to vote. They had to swear loyalty to this fake government. And so this was the way that they continued to ensure that only the leaders that promoted their agenda would ever be in power. And then very soon after that, Hawaii was considered a territory and went into statehood. Now, the interesting thing about statehood, I've read in some places that talk about how that 90% of the population voted in Hawaii to become a state in 1959. What is very interesting is that the United States actually sent thousands of their military into Hawaii, and they were not obviously citizens and residents of Hawaii, but allowed them to vote. And there were certain campaigns, we talk about voter suppression, and we've been seeing that actually in the last several years. But they did do that, and we experienced voter suppression in Hawaii to stop Native people and individuals who may not have wanted statehood from voting. What is very interesting is that after World War II, the UN actually chastised countries that snatched up other sovereign nations and said, you need to give these sovereign nations the ability to go back to being sovereign nations if that is what they want. So on this vote for statehood, what was supposed to happen was they were supposed to have three choices. The first was to stay a territory. The second was to become a state of the United States. And the third was to go back to being a sovereign kingdom, sovereign nation. And so what they chose to do was omit that third option and have all of these individuals come to Hawaii that they knew were going to vote for statehood. So these kind of things were done to definitely maintain American power within Hawaii. And then we see basically for especially Native people, loss of their ancestral land and the spread of disease continue to ravage the Native people and dwindle the population. At some point, there was even a declaration that Hawaiians should start to intermarry with other individuals. And part of it was for health reasons. They noticed that people who are pure Hawaiian really could not combat those diseases. And so the other thing you may not know is that most Hawaiians actually are quite mixed because in part, because of this situation. Okay, I'm skipping ahead a little bit. So in a nutshell, that's a very kind of quick way of telling you about kind of what happened in Hawaii. Now, sometimes when I talk to individuals about this history, I will have folks say, well, that was a long time ago. Um, it really doesn't impact us today. But like most individuals who've dealt with this kind of history, it definitely impacts us today. Because through this history and through this focus on the colonizing culture, it definitely puts the Hawaiian culture in a bad light, and certain laws and things that have been passed to actually disadvantage Native individuals. And so I also want to talk about how that's impacted Hawaiians today. So we're going to look at education. So in our educational system, and I'm just kind of jumping right in here, in our educational system, we see these rates here. So the every school in all of the United States, they must report for any student diagnosed with disabilities, the number of disciplinary action, the types of disciplinary action that has been taken. So hopefully y'all can see this pretty well. But if we look at this is broken down by ethnicity. So what we see is that the group that is most significantly impacted by being suspended from school are Native Hawaiians and other Pacific Islanders. Significantly so. And in a report by the state of Hawaii, basically it said that 26% of all students that were suspended were made up of our Kanaka children. Now, this particular one, this is, like I said, an annual report. Now, I know it says 2015 to 2016. I've actually looked for more recent data, and the state of Hawaii has not done a report since that time. So this is the most recent data. But as we're looking at this, just this particular report, we can see that Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders make up 56% of all suspensions. And they also make up 57% of all disciplinary removals. Now, I don't necessarily think that that Hawaiian children are just like the worst children in school. What's interesting is they make up, over 50% of these areas, but Hawaiians as a whole, in our own homeland, we only make up 26% of the ethnic population. But considering how bad this was, and when this report came out, there's actually, I think I have that here. So the Hawaii ACLU actually filed a complaint against the Department of Education in Hawaii and wanted an investigation to be done, because part of what they're saying is that, that obviously in their sense, looking at all of the facts, that Hawaiians are definitely, these children are being discriminated against. And I know I can share for myself, I know my son was diagnosed with dyslexia, so he would fall under this disabilities. And it was very difficult to get him any services. And it took us having to get an advocate from the Disabilities Rights Corporation to actually almost threaten the school just to give us services. So these individuals they're talking about in this article, I can see, part of what's happening is that they're not getting the services that they need. So now we're going to switch to looking at the foster care system in Hawaii and how that is impacting Hawaiians. So I have a short video to play for you folks. This video actually is of a good friend of mine. And I think that she is probably just one of the most amazing people who has given so much of her time and her aloha to kids in foster care. And so I'm going to have Aries play this video and then kind of go into some of the statistics there.
ke kaumaha loa no ke ia mau keiki, aole lako I koho nā kekahi I koho hewa. Ale he kanaka ino nā makuahine nā ohana hanau a ka ua koho hewa o ka hopena nā ke keiki. Nui ka pilikia ma ke kula, nui kona pilikia me kanahana, like behavior issues. So paakiki kona ola.
Are we having some technical difficulties?
Yeah, let me see again.
Do you think I should try and play it on my end?
Yeah, PK, let me see if it'll run through with your computer, please.
Okay, so let me pull that back
Thank
up.
you.
I hope it does.
I just changed the settings, so hopefully it'll work.
Okay, wait. Okay, so it's popping up a different screen. Okay, wait, I think I need to. Can you folks see?
Yes, still loading right now though.
How's that? Is that working?
O ke kaumaha loa no ke ia mau keiki, aole lako I koho nā kekahi I koho hewa. Ale he kanaka ino nā makuahine nā ohana hanau a ka ua koho hewa o ka hopena nā ke keiki. Nui ka pilikia ma ke kula, nui kona pilikia me kanahana, like behavior issues. So paakiki kona ola, a ka ole nana ka hewa, so pole no ale nana I koho a ka nana ka hopena.
Children in Hawaii's foster care system are among the most vulnerable in our society, and providing services and support for them is a never-ending responsibility. For Native Hawaiian children, this responsibility is especially challenging.
The number of Native Hawaiian children in foster care has reached almost 50%. Looking at the Native Hawaiian population in Hawaii, they don't make up 50%. It's complex in a way where we're trying to understand it, and we're trying to take a look at what can we do to address the disproportionalities.
Opinions vary on the causes for overrepresentation, but this problem cannot be fixed in isolation. The number of Native Hawaiian children in the foster care system is a symptom of the socioeconomic health of Native Hawaiians as a whole, which ranks worst in nearly every category of any ethnic group in Hawaii. Healing the systemic marginalization of Native Hawaiians is a generational effort well underway, with the Hawaiian community taking the lead to improve our own situation. As with other areas of need, Hawaiians are stepping up and taking action, including the traditional kuleana, or responsibility, of malama keiki, by taking in and caring for Hawaiian foster children.
Aloha, o kau'i ke ola, ko uinoa, no halawa, maiau, o ku'ukane o rako ke ola, he umi kumalua a u keiki ke ia la, o lelo wau I ke ia la no ka mea e loli koke ia ke kahi o na manawa. There's a lot of Hawaiian children out there. They need a place to go. They need a place to be loved. They need to feel safe, and we're able to help them. We don't have a lot of things. We have lots of love. God sends them to our door, so we open our door. Being Hawaiian, we have a strong culture base. Just growing up in my own family, our cousins would come and live with us for a little while. That's just the way we were raised, and that was hanai. That was not fostering. None of them were adopted. They just came for the time that they needed to be with us, and then they went back home to their own families. We have been fostering for maybe 17 or 18 years now. We had about 55 children that came through our home. Fostering isn't for everyone. It is for us. It is for some of our friends, but it's not for everyone. Most of the children, unfortunately, have some kind of exposure with drugs. So they have learning difficulties, they have behavior issues, and you just have to learn to work with each child and meet that child's needs. A lot of them have sensory disorders, so you notice our house is very loud.
Oh, I have baby Jesus.
They don't have volume control. Everything is loud, everything is hard, and you just learn to live with it. We're a loud house, but it makes it more fun. Everyone works together to make our family work because we have to be a team. No one can do this by themselves. I don't even do this by myself. Without my husband and the two girls, there's no way I could do this. We all have to work together. And so that's their way of learning that concept. Lokahi. We have to all help each other and have each other's back.
The Keola family is unique in the number of foster keiki they have taken in as their own. Any ohana interested in fostering children.
Okay. So I'm cutting it short. I don't want to do the whole video. Oh wait.
Is provided?
Okay. I'm back. But I think that makes a really interesting point, and I know in other places, this is true for other communities, right, where there's a lot of kids in foster care, and there's the issues around drugs, alcohol, and different factors in the homes that have basically meant that these children have ended up in foster care and not living with their families. So let me continue with the presentation. So part of what we find, oh, and by the way, that I was saying that was a friend of mine. I don't know if you noticed, she had in the green shirt, it was her son that was, I know there's lots of kids in that video, but I met her, I had the honor of meeting her. She's such an amazing person, because her son, who was the very first individual that she adopted, is the same age as my oldest daughter. And we have schools called Hawaiian language immersion schools that we call Kaiapuni. And Kau'i actually was a teacher at one of those schools for many years. And so what you heard also was the Hawaiian language, which is something that most Native people do not speak, as I explained previously. And so that's another thing, in trying to regain that part of our culture as well. But that's anyway how I first met her. But going back to the foster care system, we know basically in reports that I've looked up since 2014 that our children are making up almost 50% of the foster care system, children in foster care. And I think the things that are probably the most devastating and hard to know is that specifically Kanaka children, more than any other ethnicity, are recommended to be taken out of the home, away from their families. And they also, at much higher rates, are not ever recommended to be reunited. And what is interesting when they look at the cases, when they take quantitative data, it's not even like the situations are so much more dangerous, right? So it makes it very difficult to try and wrap your head around, then why is it different with our Native children, our Native families? And because they're not reunited, basically, they're staying in foster care much longer than other ethnicity of children, and they're aging out of the system. So they're coming out as wards of the court, with a lot of kind of transient situations. So all of this is definitely creating, as I'm sure a lot of people have heard, that pipeline from, you know, school to prison. I mean, that's in large part what we're seeing quite a bit of, because our children are not being invested in, they're being in these kinds of systems. And then the next thing we're looking at is incarceration rates, as you may have guessed. So basically, our Native Hawaiian population, they tend to be more likely to be incarcerated than be given probation. For the same crimes, they tend to be given longer prison sentences. And specifically our Kanaka, as our prisons become more overcrowded, they at a larger percentage are sent away from Hawaii. And some people might say, well, they committed a crime, you know, wherever they end up, it's kind of their fault. But also, if we're trying to help them with the process of healing and, you know, becoming productive citizens again, so that we don't have to continue to pay to incarcerate individuals, because it is a huge price for us. It is very difficult to do that when you're never allowed to see your family. And particularly, I think for Indigenous people, the idea and the concept of their connection to land, we do not see ourselves as different from the land. You know, we, in many ways, is an extension of the land, right? Everything that we do and the self-concept we have for ourselves, you know, land is provider, land is teacher, land is mother, land is everything. And so to be plucked out of that, away from your actual biological family and your one hanau, the place that you were born, is absolutely devastating. But we see that more and more, especially with the privatization of prisons, because that is big business, right? These organizations that are creating this prison system and basically kind of selling it to that state, are making lots of money off of this. And they're telling the state, if you want us to stay, you need to keep, like in many places, the prisons have to be 90% filled for them to make a profit. And so if that's true, then you have to consistently convict people of crimes to have the prisons filled. So it's this really kind of devastating, and in many ways, I think a very evil kind of policy to make. In Hawaii, Kanaka men and women make up the largest percentage of prison populations. In the men's prison, it's at about 50%. In the women's prison, it's about 44%. What I also find interesting is that in Hawaii, that methamphetamines is the only drug that carries a mandatory sentence. So whether it includes a violent offense or not, we actually have it where when a decision and a sentence is passed down, that if it involves this particular drug, that they cannot give a sentence for less than the mandatory terms. And primarily it is Kanaka who are charged the most with offenses for meth. And in a report from 2009, Kanaka made up 32% of all people admitted to prison for drug offenses, many of which are nonviolent. So having said all of that, and I know that was a lot of information, I also wanted to talk about more on the ground how that impacts people today. And so one of the things that I wanted to talk about was how that specifically has impacted me as a Native person. So I picked this picture because I think this is very, very representative of my ohana. We like to be goofy, we like to laugh, we like to have fun. And, I've been very blessed to have these 3 amazing children come into my life who at times work my last nerve, but, that's what I signed up for when I became a parent. And I know some of you on the call are from previous, you've come to Hawaii during the alternative spring break. So some of you have met my children actually. But anyway, so this is the year that, if you were trying to figure it out, the year that we decided to dress as a group of individuals from Alice in Wonderland. And my husband chose to be Alice, which I thought was absolutely awesome of him to do. But, outside of our costumes, this is my family. This was at my daughter's graduation, which I feel super old. She just graduated this past year. And, I think having shared that history, one thing I want to share with you is that I never knew that history growing up. I had no idea. And I've even talked to other Kanaka who believe that our monarchs and our ancestors just kind of rolled over and they didn't fight, they didn't do anything. And I grew up thinking that it was a revolution, right? That the people rose up against the monarchy. And my family is representative of many Native people in Hawaii today. If I look at my background, my great-grandparents, I had a set that came from Puerto Rico. I had a set that came from Spain. Obviously, I had a group that was Native that was already here. And also, I had one of my great-grandfathers was from New Jersey. He was Irish. And that's my background. And then my husband, his family is from Panama, and they were of African descent. And he also has a little bit German. I know he doesn't look like it. And obviously he's Native as well. And so our children are a mix of all these different people, and they have all these different ancestors and different stories. And the difference for them is that we definitely, my husband and I, made a conscious effort to look at and learn our history so that we could change. They have, what is that saying? If you don't know and learn your history, that you are doomed to repeat it. That was definitely something that we did not want. And while I showed you all of those statistics, what happens in our educational system and foster care and in the criminal justice system here in Hawaii, I think the biggest thing, and this is what I want to say, and I'm so glad to be able to talk to, as an educator, be talking to students who have decided to take this path of education, is that education is the great equalizer. I definitely grew up very differently than the way my life is today, very differently than the way my children are growing up. I have some pictures in here of my home. I grew up in Wai'anae, which is on the island of Oahu. It is has the largest population of Native Hawaiians in all of Hawaii. And it is in the country. I grew up on a farm. I definitely take pride in saying that I am a country girl and an island girl. And growing up, these are the things that I saw. And being able to connect with the spaces around me. Not fully understanding my history, but understanding that I lived in a really powerful, special place. Of course, the ocean is a really big part of our culture. These are pictures I actually took, by the way. These are not like from postcards or that I pulled off the internet. But this is my home. Yes, I did swim with an eel. They don't bug you, by the way. They're more, when they say they're more scared of you than you are of them, for the most part, that's true. But don't chance it. And yes, like I said, water sports are a big part, especially where I live. We actually have been in the National Geographic magazine for surfing and surfing competitions. We love the water so much that when we see signs like this, right, dangerous shore break, could have serious injuries and drowning, If you pan like 20 feet to the right, this is what you see. Like nobody pays attention. Those, as far as we're concerned, those signs are for the tourists. But in addition, in my community, we see a lot of this as well. Remember I told you about America wanting to create a military stronghold in the Pacific and acquiring Hawaii to do it. Well, we are very, very militarized. So this is on the way to one of actually our sacred sites. So we have a military, in this case, it's Air Force, right smack dab in the middle of that. And you need a permit. If you don't get permission, up in these mountains, as a child, we used to pick different plants to make lei, and we cannot go there anymore. They have these satellites on the top of that same mountain to track different things in the Pacific and gather intelligence. In the next valley over, which is Makua Valley, it's a beautiful valley that had many endemic, endangered plants and animals. But for about almost 20 years of my life, they actually use it for target practice. So for a lot of my childhood, this whole valley was black and charred. You see that it's a military installation. And if you look close, so it's all gated off. But you see signs like this. So because they've bombed this area so much, you can't walk here because you may step on unexploded ordnances. And this sign sits on a beach where we would fish all the time. And now it says that it's government property and you can't go there. And it is challenging because as Native people, you know, we can invoke gathering rights. The hard part is that that doesn't mean they don't still try to arrest you. And then you have to have the money to fight them in court. So a lot of times people just stop using our spaces for cultural practice. So that sign was on this coastline here. And also in my community, you see homes like this. Now people still live there. And here too. And this is our large state-run transitional housing facility for individuals that don't have houses to go home to. Many Native people do not want to go into these facilities because many times they're actually, a lot of the requirements, a lot of Kanaka feel that it's super restrictive. So across the street, we have a whole group, large group, probably almost 200 people that live in the bushes, basically. And I have taken the alternative spring break folks here to meet the people. And it's interesting, they're organized in such a way where they have their own schools, they have captains that take care of different sections of the area. And there's quite a bit of people that live here. And it is situated next to a school for voyaging. So this right here structure is a voyaging school. And I find that really interesting. You know, if you remember at the beginning of my talk, I talked about the idea of wayfinding. And it's much more than just finding your place from one island to the next. It's really about finding your way in life. And so I think there's something really symbolic and really poetic about having a school for wayfinding right next to one of the largest houseless encampments that we have on the west side. And next to the school, there's this beautiful storage container that they've painted. And on one side of it, it has this chant or song. And the title of it says, Warrior of Wai'anae, which is the town that I'm showing you, my place that I grew up. And it's asking, where is the beauty out on the ocean? And it says, it's the bird. What kind of bird? It's the Eva bird, but she's lost her feathers to the wind. And then it says awe, and awe usually is, it means, you know, that's terrible, or it's something that you express when you're sad. but it says holo mai oe ika moana, right? That it'll come back on the ocean, and that even the pain that you feel inside, that it can be cured with love, with aloha. And it continues to ask, who or where are the warriors of Wai'anae? And then it says, rise up, wake up. And it asks again, where are the warriors of Wai'anae? I get emotional because we are still fighting. And it's hard sometimes as a parent to tell my children that they have to fight. But if they don't, then everything I just showed you will continue to persist. The incarceration, the low education rates, the poverty. We have to know who we are, and we have to be willing to fight for what we believe in. And I think the challenge is what I share with you is just a small part of what's going on in the entire world. So many individuals have the same history. It's just in a different part of the world. And I think that the more we can educate ourselves, the more that we can create those connections, right? To commit to create those connections, that we'll be able to be happy and healthy and live in aloha. So I want to leave you with that today. I believe that when you educate yourself, when you choose to be a leader, when you choose to be informed, when you choose to do what is right and to affect positive change and work for justice, that you are a warrior too. And we need more courageous warriors, not for violence, but fighting for justice. And so with that, I will end my presentation. I appreciate your time, and I will open up for questions. So I appreciate your thank yous. I'm gonna say mahalo to you. Mahalo is our word for thanks or appreciation. I appreciate you folks coming and listening. I know I went through a lot of information. All right, so I have a question. I know you discussed that you recently just had to advocate for services for your son. Was this at a public or at a Indigenous Hawaiian immersion school? Is there major differences in funding and resources between the two? That's a great question. So to answer your question, my son goes to a public school, and it is a Hawaiian language immersion school inside of a public Hawaii Department of Education school. And what is interesting is that the DOE schools do get more funding than the charter Native Hawaiian schools. DOE schools get a lot more. And yes, there are major differences with the funding. I would say, to be honest, that my son or my son's school does get more money because they exist inside of a traditional English speaking DOE. Like if he was in a charter school that was Hawaiian language immersion separate, they would get definitely a lot less funding and also a lot less services. And that's generally the way that it is in Hawaii. I hope that answers your question.
There's another question by Scott on the chat. It is my understanding that many traditional Hawaiian practices such as hula, kakoi, and the oli connect Native Hawaiians to their ancestors, not just metaphorically, but literally. If that understanding is correct, was it part of the motivation of the Kapuna who went underground during missionary times to stay literal relationships with their ancestors?
Okay, so you said hula. So kakao or tatau, I think you're saying is tattooing. Yeah, hula, tatau, oli, chant, yes. So wait, was it part of the motivation of Kupuna who went underground in the missionary times to stay in literal relationship? Yeah, so that is a great question. So the idea of ancestors also, and I want to be really clear about this. So ancestor was the earth. There was also a sense that when you passed out of your physical life, that sometimes that your ancestors could actually come back in the form of a turtle or a shark. You know, it kind of depended on what your ohana did. If you were somebody who like was who fished, you probably would likely have more of those family guardians in the ocean as opposed to anywhere else. But yes, I mean, Hawaiians definitely believe that whatever they learned, that they could definitely learn it, not just while the person was alive, but actually potentially if they took the time to, in their sense, like pray or commune with their environment, that things would come to them. So yeah, the constant trying to, I hope I'm answering your question, Scott, but being in these spaces and communing with their ancestors, whether that be praying to them directly or experiencing them in their physical environment, was critical. Yes.
Okay, I think we have another question on the question and answer. Do you think Hawaii would survive without tourism?
You know, as a Native person, I'm going to tell you emphatically yes. If you ask our politicians, they're going to tell you no. You know, Hawaii was a thriving society way before tourism. You know, we have definitely put all of our eggs in one basket when it comes to tourism. And what we've done is we've become food insecure. We have used so much of our land for hotels and, you know, all these things to support this industry, but ultimately we're not supporting ourselves. We're not supporting our ability to take care of ourselves. And we've made ourselves incredibly dependent. And especially with COVID, you thought you were gonna make it through this presentation without hearing that word. But especially because of COVID, we realize how fragile we actually are. And so there's more and more people, believe it or not, who are looking at moving away from tourism because nobody can come here. And actually people who do come here, it's kind of limited right now. We don't have high cases, but we want to keep it that way. And so more and more people are saying, look, like if this thing is going to be impacting us and all these businesses are closing down, we have to look at something else. So it's interesting that it's taken this COVID-19 crisis to force us to actually look at taking care of our land and our people. So I find that very interesting.
There's a follow-up question to that from Burke. What are the best practices can visitors take when they choose to visit?
I love that question. So, you know, so maybe I can answer this with a story. When I first met Dan, I met Dan and if folks remember Steve, we were wanting to come to University of Arizona initially because we wanted to see how other Native groups organize themselves in Western institutions, how they organize Native programming and spaces. And so it was really interesting because as soon as we were kind of done almost talking about some of those things, they started sharing how in their alternative spring break, they come to Hawaii. And what was really interesting is they were very clear, like, I don't want to do touristy stuff. Like, I want to go where Native people are. I want to see how you live. And I want to like be able to honor your spaces. And I don't normally hear people say that, right? They want to go to Waikiki, and nothing bad about Waikiki, but it looks like almost any other city on the beach. So I kind of feel suffocated when I go to that place. So we took them out to the country, like some of those pictures that I showed you, and we really talked to them about what does it mean to be in sacred spaces, and what do we expect from you, and what is it that you need to do, and they're very open. And so, you know, I think the hard part about the question is if you don't know a Native person, it's very difficult sometimes to know what is appropriate, right? Because it's kind of almost like you need a guide. I I will offer this though. I mean, if you're coming to Hawaii, you have my email address. That's my real email address. And so, you know, if you want to talk before you come or while you're here, I'm definitely happy to share, you know, and answer questions. But I think, you know, I guess short of not having or knowing a Native person, you know, to research some things. And like I said, I do need to give maybe Dan, is there a way, Dan, that I can give people resources in addition to the references that I made use of in my presentation?
Yep, you can send it to me, and then we have everybody's email that is on this webinar that we can send out from there.
Okay, so I mean, I can also give additional information about educating yourself about some things that you should know before you come. I mean, just the fact that you attended this presentation, this is information, like I said, most people don't know. And I mean, I've actually met a bunch of people who don't care either, you know, so I appreciate that you took the time to learn this. So mahalo.
Yeah, and we're crossing our fingers that this travel restriction will be lifted so you all can come with us to Hawaii in the future. Of course, it's canceled this altered spring break just because our university does not have a spring break this year, or is not having spring break this year. Another question from the chat. This is for Celine. I went to the Polynesian Cultural Center in Hawaii. Would you say that the Polynesian Cultural Center in Hawaii portrays the Hawaiian history to the fullest?
I think that they try and do it, I want to say as best as they can. You know, remember that it's a commercial place, right? And if we really did like really traditional things, I think that would take away from people's experience of like coming and eating what they think is native, you know, indigenous foods and watching hula. I wouldn't say like it's a really authentic experience. I think they, as much as they can in a very commercial way, they try to portray it as best as they can, but it's really not. I mean, like if you came to my house for a luau, it would be very different, you know, and you would see like grandma would be getting up and, you know, your cousin would be coming in from like with octopus he just caught and we'd be cooking it up. Like it would just feel really different than what you would see at a very commercial kind of luau. And you know, it's interesting because anytime that the gel program has come out and I've been hosting, Dan and I always have this conversation around, you know, like if he's gonna go to one of those like luau places, I always have this feeling in the pit of my stomach, and Dan's like, I know, but you know, it's not as authentic. I think it's as close as you're gonna get in a commercial setting. I guess that's the best way I can answer that question.
Okay, we have time for about 2 more questions that we have in the Q&A. The first one, do Native Hawaiians have any federal or state benefits given to them purely based on their status as Native people?
Oh gosh, in general, no. We had one of our monarchs, and this is after, oh my gosh, this is after the overthrow of the government. He did go to the Congress, US Congress, and he asked about setting aside land for Hawaiians, because Hawaiians in this, well, essentially seizing of our land and our kingdom, lost a lot of their ancestral land. And so they said yes. And what was really interesting was that their thinking was that when they removed many Native American individuals and tribes and put them on lands, many of which was not their ancestral land, and a lot of times were hard, you know, to farm and to even live on, they had the same thinking in Hawaii as well. And so a lot of the lands that have been set aside, we call homestead land, is not in desirable areas. They're in the areas that, you know, people who are farming sugar cane didn't want. And then they implemented a blood quantum, which we never had before. But they saw how divisive it was for Native Americans to say, if you're not 50%, you kind of get benefits, right? And while they weren't giving us benefits in Hawaii, what they were saying is you have to be 50% Hawaiian to even live on the land. And so once they implemented the blood quantum, it created a lot of divisiveness in the Hawaiian community, which is exactly what they wanted. They saw how effective that was, making Native people fight against each other to the point where they didn't have to worry about them because they were fighting each other. They wanted to do the same thing in Hawaii, to be quite honest. And it's still that way till this day. You have people who are 50% Hawaiian who have this whole like, well, I'm more Hawaiian and I should have more say in this and that. But homestead, which is very hard to get, by the way, is probably one of the only benefits through our government. I kind of hear you, Dan.
The questions keep on coming in, so these are the last two questions. Why are Native Hawaiians opposed to U.S. federal recognition?
Okay, I need to try and make that a short answer. Well, as you can see, you know, the way that sovereignty is viewed, if you look at it based on international law, is that you cannot lose your sovereignty unless the sovereign of your nation has given that up through signing a legal treaty of annexation. That never occurred in Hawaii. And so just by occupying Hawaii, which actually, by the way, is a war crime and a violation of international law, you cannot just occupy a place and start implementing the laws of your country. So currently, based on international law, America has been illegally occupying Hawaii, and which is a war crime, and committing that for, you know, over 100 years. So the idea of federal recognition means that we're saying basically we're not sovereign, right? And also, I think, you know, we definitely, many of our leaders have had many conversations also with Native American individuals who've talked about a lot of the pitfalls of that federal recognition. And so many Kanaka are not interested in that. They're interested in a form of self-governance, and there are lots of different ways we can reach that. I won't go into that, but the sense that federal recognition would dismiss our sovereignty is significant to most Kanaka, which is something we do not want to happen.
Okay, and then the last question, can you talk about how the Queen's Trust aims to mitigate some of these issues that you talked about?
Oh, you know about the Queen's Trust. I have some people in the know on this call. So there's something called the Queen Liliuokalani Children's Center, and that is funded through the Queen's Trust. Now, I don't know if you remember, I was saying how monarchs in Hawaii definitely focused on the betterment of their people. And so we had Princess Pauahi, who created a school for Native Hawaiians, which I was privileged enough to attend and actually learn about my culture. And that was through her trust. We had another queen who literally walked door to door getting donations to create a hospital during a time when a lot of our Kanaka were dying of these introduced diseases. And then we had Liliuokalani, who created her trust to help children who are orphaned, primarily because their parents had passed from these diseases. And so there are different locations throughout Hawaii where the monies are used primarily for children whose parents have passed away. And it is an organization that I volunteer in. I volunteer in a bunch, but that's definitely one of them. And so most of her monies, actually, her trust goes toward that. So children, Native Hawaiian children who identify as, they use the term orphans, if one or both of their parents have passed away, they can get funding for school scholarships, for basic needs, and also for different programs to help them deal with a variety of issues, as you can imagine, as a young person losing your parents. So that's primarily what the trust goes toward.
So thank you for answering those questions. We have a little bit more questions, and hopefully we can answer those at the end. I know we're running out of time for this webinar. So we just want to thank you so much for this opportunity to speak with you. And this is just a wealth of information that I learned something every time you speak. And we've known each other for 3 to 4 years. So if you want to learn more, like I said, usually Gel does a alternative spring break Hawaii experience during spring break. Once we get that travel restriction lifted, hopefully we can travel there again and experience it in person. Once again, this is helping celebrate our Native Heritage Month this month, and we will have some more opportunities to see some more webinars in December. We are funded by the student services fee, and we will be sending you all a post assessment. If you can please fill that out, that helps fund more opportunities like this, and hopefully more opportunities once we can actually travel in the future. But we want to thank you so much, Pi'ikea, for your knowledge, your breadth and your heart in speaking to our students. And hopefully each and every one of you learned a little bit more than Hawaii just being a tourist destination. So thank you so much, and mahalo.
Thank you for having me. Mahalo.